The Constitution is clear that interprovincial infrastructure, such as pipelines, are the exclusive authority of the federal government.
We agree to disagree on this point. I don't see how we can have a new pipeline on the Quebec territory without the approval of Quebecers.
I understand that it is a sensitive issue in Quebec. Signing up to a pipeline is not 40 or 50 years of signing up to fossil fuels. It's providing the best form of transportation that is existing today, the safest and most reliable.
I made a commitment to British Columbians during an election campaign to defend our coast.
Some clear divisions there on pipelines as Canada's premiers wrapped up their annual meeting in Saskatoon yesterday. The premiers worked on numerous issues but couldn't agree on a national energy corridor. Quebec Premier François Legault is open, he says, to a natural gas pipeline but insists there's no social acceptability for oil pipelines in his province. The premiers are unanimous, though, that they alone should determine their respective climate plans. What do the premiers' stances indicate about the health of the Federation, and how might their priorities affect the fall federal election campaign? Time to bring in the Premiers League. In Vancouver, Christy Clark, Premier of BC from 2011 to 2017, now Senior Advisor with Bennett Jones. And here with me, Robert Ghiz, Premier of P.E.I. from 2007 to 2015, now President and CEO of the Canadian Wireless Telecommunications Association. Hi to both of you. Nice to see you. Thanks for doing this. Ms. Clark, I'll start with you. There was kind of this pre-meeting before the meeting of the premiers between what many of them described as like-minded. What did you think of that idea, and do you think it sort of had any kind of impact on a divide that we did see sort of emerge later on?
Well, I think that if you want to make your voice heard at the Premier's table, there are two ways to go about it. One is to keep, options open with all of the premiers around the table and continue to talk to them, which is kind of, I think, which is what was my experience at in the era that I was there. I think Rob probably had the same experience. It does seem now, though, all these men around the table, very divided, terrible relations between British Columbia and Alberta. I feel like they're sort of dividing into tribes and, teams. And I think that's really what we saw, is a country vividly divided. And rather than premiers kind of finding a way to get along all the time, I think there's a little bit of kind of competitiveness between them and a lot less cooperation than we once saw.
What were your impressions, Mr. Ghiz? Did you see that kind of divide as well?
There's always going to be somewhat of a divide, especially when you get this close to a federal election and you've got different premiers that have their own political agendas as well. But I don't really see a problem with different premiers getting together and creating strategic alliances and building on relationships. A lot of these premiers, besides probably two or three of them, this is actually their first term elected. So they're just really starting to develop these relationships. I was fortunate that I knew Christy from way back in a different political career, so we've always had a good relationship. But while I was there, Brad Wall and I were able to forge a very strong relationship. And if you looked at us on paper, you would think that we were polar opposites, but we ended up becoming best friends. And I think that led to some extra developments taking place at the Premier's table because we did work on those relationships. So I think, as Christy said, relationships are extremely important, and it does help move the agenda along. You
sort of referenced, Ms. Clark, eras, when you guys were at the table versus right now. What do you think some of the big differences are that might prompt that kind of divide that you referenced?
Well, I think in general, we are seeing a much more partisan country, a much more divided country. The federal Liberals have really vacated the center and they've moved to the left. The federal Conservatives are kind of, they feel more to the right, to me, at least in their language, than they were previously. So I feel like country's a little more divided. We've seen governments are, I think, a little bit more confrontational. I was there in an era where you tried to work with the federal government. I think the federal government's habit of deciding that they want to just in a high-handed way behave unilaterally, overrule provinces, get into areas of exclusive provincial jurisdiction has been very bad for that relationship and for the country. And I think the third thing is, there are no women at the table anymore. And when, the fact is, in my experience at cabinet, where almost half my cabinet was almost always women, is it really does change the behavior around the table, and it tends to make it a little bit more collaborative. And I think that element, probably not the most important of those three elements, is being seen right now.
What about the federal election, that federal-provincial dynamic? Because in the lead up to this, that's where, Mr. Ghiz, the focus was certainly placed on. We have seen so much jockeying between the two. Ms. Clark talks about the role of the federal government and how she views their behavior in this respect. Jurisdiction was definitely a big topic of discussion. What do you think about all of that?
Yeah, I definitely see the divide, and I think Christy's absolutely right when it comes to the eras. And the era when Christy and I were there, when you had Stephen Harper, who was laissez-faire with the provinces. So it actually allowed the provinces to play a larger role in terms of nation building, whereas now we have the Trudeau government that's more involved, whether or not it's carbon pricing or different issues, involved in a whole lot of areas that do affect the provinces more directly. You're also seeing, and I agree with Christy, that the Trudeau Liberals are not traditional in the centre where usually they were. They're a little more to the left. And now you're seeing provincial governments that are, you know, not so much progressive conservative governments, but almost conservative governments as well, even though a few of them call themselves progressive conservatives. And
so what do you think is, help us understand what's happening behind the scenes? Let's take an issue like, for example, Ms. Clark, a pipeline that goes through the country. We heard a lot of discussion about this, tons of questions to Mr. Legault, Premier Legault, who was insistent that there's no social acceptability for something like that would go through Quebec. But then you see the other side talking about the federal government having constitutional authority. And I mean, so much of the discussion, at least in the public, revolved around that. What's happening behind the scenes there, do you think? Is there any way at a meeting like this there could be movement on a subject like that?
You know, I despair of any concordance amongst the premiers. I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, I live in British Columbia, and so I see this divide. But you know, Alberta and British Columbia used to be the closest provinces of any in the in the country to one another, and it's you know, John Horgan could not be more different in his views on this, on pipelines, than Jason Kenney. So I don't think you're going to see any agreement between the provinces, which is why it is so important, because the federal government does have constitutional authority here, but they aren't using it. And that really is the problem, is the failure of the federal government to step up, protect middle-class jobs, fight for all the funding that goes toward healthcare that comes from the biggest sector of our economy in oil and gas, and really do its job and protect the Canadian economy. They haven't done it. They've abdicated their role there, and until they decide to step in, I don't think you're going to see a solution come from premiers.
To be fair, there isn't, Mr. Ghiz, a pipeline proponent right now for that. There was, of course, Energy East. Mr. Scheer, you know, the leader of the federal Conservatives, I've asked him as well, would you be willing, if there was such a thing, hypothetically, a pipeline, would you be willing to exercise that constitutional authority? He won't give me a direct answer on that. Talk a bit about the considerations, especially where Quebec is concerned, and what is that like behind closed doors? Yeah,
I think you've hit the nail on the head. You know, really, it would be a disaster politically to go into a federal election and saying, I'm going to impose a pipeline on Quebec. Nobody's going to do that. Andrew Scheer's not doing that. They're all saying there are processes now in place. There is a constitutionality that does exist for the federal government to approve these things, and there's processes. We saw the federal government step up to the plate out west. They put their money where their mouth was. They bought a pipeline. But I think that I want to go back to the premiers' meetings and how you do move the needle a little bit. And the one thing I do like about premiers' meetings, and I'm not sure if Christy will agree with me on this, but there are sometimes some movement within the room. And I think there is movement within the room because unlike some other First Ministers' meetings, they're not publicly televised. And sometimes when you sit in a room with just the 13 premiers, you are able to move that needle a little bit. And I think where we've seen the needle move a touch, and I like to call it wiggle room, is you've seen now the Premier of Quebec talk about social acceptability. He's not talking about we're against it. He's just saying there's not social acceptability.
Pointing to those polls.
Exactly. So in other words, if you can switch around that social accessibility, so if they can perhaps put a demand on the table that they need some approvals to move their hydro to different provinces, then maybe they'd be willing to back off on that social acceptability.
Ms. Clark, do you agree? Final word to you.
I think so. And you know, Rob was a real unifying force around the table. He'd been there a long time when I was there and kind of bringing people together. So he, you know, has a lot of experience at kind of understanding how this work comes together. But I will just say this, the federal government killed the Northern Gateway pipeline. They killed the Energy East pipeline, and they still haven't turned a shovel of dirt on the Kinder Morgan pipeline. I mean, my argument that they've vacated the field and refused to step up on this, I think, is a pretty sound one. And again, I would just end, even with Rob around the table again, I don't think we'll get there on pipelines unless the federal government decides to step up and decide they want to fight for this country.
For the sake of balance, they are. I think the Prime Minister is turning. I think they are at the TMX site today. They are promising that this construction season there will be.
Does he have a shovel
there
in his
will
hand?
be. No, he might have for the photo op. I have to double check
And for the
that.
strike, it wasn't built during the Harper years either. So, there was a balance when there was those demands there as well.
All right, we have to leave it there right now. But thank you very much to both of you for joining us. Thanks to Christy Clark, former Premier of BC, and Robert Ghiz, former Premier of P.E.I. Appreciate your time, both of you, today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vashti. Thanks, Christy.
Thanks, Rob.
Hi, I'm Vashti Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.